Rise, soon will be our home forever, and the smile of the blessed giver gladdens all our longing eyes. Here our feet are often Oh, for grace to trust him more. Oh, 'tis sweet to trust in Jesus, just from sin and self to cease. Just from Jesus simply taking life and rest and joy and peace. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I proved him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. I'm so glad I learned to trust thee, precious Jesus, Savior, friend, and I know that thou art with me, wilt be with me to the end. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I proved him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more.
Good morning. Our scripture this morning comes from Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw that I was at Shemen in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Eliah. Then I lifted up mine eyes, and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will, and became great.
How's everybody doing this morning? I'm glad to hear that. Is everybody awake now? All right, I'll give you some time to sleep here. I'll tell you, the last couple of weeks, this has been a rough crowd. I tried some of my best jokes even, and I couldn't even get a courtesy chuckle from anybody. So that's something we established, me and my friends, or my friends and I should say. Even if it's not that worthy, give a quick chuckle, and we call that the courtesy chuckle. Everybody gets one, Ben, but that's about it. So I have my chart this morning. All right, that was from a sermon we began last Sunday night? All right. Laura remembers. She takes such great notes of my sermons, and we discuss them on the way home. I ask her what I preached on, and she'll say, Jesus. I'm glad I have Ben here this morning. Ben is who I used to model this statue right here. So he used to have a bigger beard than he does now. But we looked at the image of Daniel from chapter 2. We focused in chapter 2 on these 5 kingdoms, and we looked in the comparison of Daniel chapter 7, where the head, which was Babylon, made of fine gold, was considered to be a lion with wings of an eagle. And then we looked at the chest and the arms, which were of silver. They were a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth in Daniel chapter 7. We noticed the belly and thighs of bronze. They were the leopard in Daniel chapter 7. And then the legs and feet of iron mixed with clay. They were the beast with 10 horns, which of course was Rome. And finally, the last kingdom was the kingdom of heaven, which is represented in this stone right here. And that is a representation of Jesus and his church. And we focused that evening on the last kingdom, which is Rome. And I didn't go too deep into the third kingdom, which is Greece. The reason I didn't is because Daniel does that in chapter 8. Now, I want to tell you something. I had a lot of trepidation in deciding to preach this sermon on Sunday morning. I came into Laura each day last week and I said, do you think it'd be all right if I did a sermon on prophecy on Sunday morning? You see, I haven't done that here. Generally, I reserve sermons on prophecy for Sunday night. But then I began to think, well, you all on Sunday morning, those who can't make it on Sunday night, miss quite a bit when it comes to prophecy and the history that is entailed in the fulfillment of that prophecy. So this morning, if you like history, we're going to be looking at those 400 years in between the two testaments. By testaments, I mean in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And what kingdoms made up that time period? The one we're going to be focused on this morning is the kingdom of Greece. And I've got another sermon tonight from Daniel chapter 9 on the 70 weeks. Now, everyone has assured me here that I have not preached that lesson. I am 100% sure that I have, but you all went back through the great notes that you took, and you assure me that I haven't. So if it is a repeat, I want you to pretend like you've never heard it. Okay? All right. Daniel chapter 8, the first 4 verses, which Dale read for us. And by the way, you did a very good job reading that. Sometimes some of those words can be difficult, but we're talking about a place. And the place during this time is the kingdom of Persia. So the chapter begins with Persia. Now I hope, can you all see that? Yeah. I did not use Ben as a model for this ram. But it's a ram with 2 horns, okay? And what you find in those first 4 verses is there is this ram, and he has 2 horns. Now this is the vision of Daniel. Daniel has these dreams. And Daniel can also interpret other people's dreams. I would love to have someone who can interpret my dreams. I dream a lot. A lot of people talk to me and they say they don't have dreams. And there's a lot of people who talk to me and say when they do have dreams, they don't remember their dreams very well. Well, I definitely have a lot of dreams, and some of them I remember, some of them I don't. But my dreams are very, very vivid. So much so that I scare my family sometimes. And last night I had one of those. I was crying out for Laura. She said, I just kept saying, Laura, help! Laura, help! So I want to admit here this morning that I am crying out for help. But it wasn't help from Laura. She heard Laura help, but it was help. Laura, help! So if someone could interpret that dream for me this morning, I would certainly appreciate that. Moving on. The ram has these 2 horns. Well, who are these 2 horns? Well, there is a lesser horn and there is a higher horn. The lesser horn represents the kingdom of Persia, the Medes and the Persians. You remember on this chart over here, the Medes and the Persians, they are the chest and arms of silver. They are the bear. The bear is a very large monster, okay? He is a creature that can do a great amount of damage. And in this image, in Daniel chapter 7, he had 3 ribs. These 3 ribs represented the country of Lydia, which was in Asia Minor. We would call that area Turkey today. So these were turkey ribs, right? So he has these three ribs. It's Lydia and Egypt and Babylon, because these are the nations that the Medo-Persians conquered, the three dominant cities of those nations. Now, he is raised up on one hand, the bear is. The reason that is the case is because one is greater than the other. The Medes were lesser than the Persians. When you think of that time, you understand that it is called the Persian Empire, but technically it was the Medo-Persian Empire. Now then, we have great kings that came from the Medo-Persian Empire. There is Darius the second, there is Darius the fourth, but the character that we are mostly and primarily concerned with from the Bible is King Cyrus. Have you ever heard of King Cyrus? I thought it was interesting. His name floated around quite a bit when people would discuss Donald Trump. You remember hearing Donald Trump being compared to King Cyrus? Maybe you're not political. I try not to be. As a matter of fact, I want to tell you, since I moved here, I have not watched the news very much at all. And Laura just told me yesterday, boy, Josh, you seem to be have so much less stress than you ever had before. Well, Cyrus is the great king. He is the liberator of the Jews. He is the one that let them go back to their homeland. Now then, the lesser horn is Darius the Mede, and the greater horn in this image is Cyrus. But there is this ram that's pushing from the west, and he's going west, and he's going to the north, and he's going to the south, and no beast can stand before him. And so we are presented with this beast in verse 5 through 8. If you're following along, verse 5 says, "And as I was considering, behold," and I love the term that the King James uses, a he-goat. Now in this day and age where pronouns are fluid and people are able to transition easily between them, the King James authors must have envisioned a time where it would have to be more specific, so they said, here we have this he-goat. He came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and he touched not the ground. The goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and he ran into him with the fury of his power. You ever watched two rams fight? Man, when they hit horns, it is loud, and they say you could feel the ground even. All right? I understand that appeal. In the early 90s, this is when I was in high school. Laura, even you remember the 90s, right? She was born in 1989. She reminds me every day. Matter of fact, I said, well, you were going into kindergarten when I was a senior. She said, no, the year you graduated, I went into kindergarten. But in the 90s, there was one thing that we had to do. We had in Bellsville the opportunity, and by the way, every one of us, except one guy, had to buy his own first car. I think that's a good tradition to keep. Make your kids buy their first car. My first car was 4 cars. Dale, I went to the junkyard, and I got a salvage title on 4 Volkswagen Rabbits from the 70s. And I made 1 car out of them. It was 5 different colors, and the prominent color was rust. But even though that car was a piece of junk, and by the way, when it would get to 55, it would shake tremendously. It would not go over 55. But it was fun on the interstate. Yes. But I had this car, and even though it was a piece of junk, we put our money into what we called the system. Do you know what the system was? That was a box that you made out of wood, and you put 15-inch kicker speakers in. And then you would, underneath the seat, run all of these wires. to an amp, and then from the amp you would go to the battery. From the battery you'd go to the actual system, and you would have the bass turned up as high as you could, which sounded really funny. When everybody else was playing rap, you could hear my banjo echoing through the hollers. But we did that, and what was funny is you could feel the beat a mile away. We knew who was coming to school because we could hear him on Copper Kettle Turn. All right? And when these rams run into each other, it is so loud you can actually feel it. There's so much pressure. So get this image. Here comes a he-goat, this ram, and he's got this one horn. And there is the other ram who has the two horns. One is more prominent than the other. And this he-goat is going so fast that he doesn't even touch the ground. He just leaps. All right? The he-goat came with one horn from the west. This horn, this notable horn, is Alexander the Great. We'll talk a little more about him in a few moments. By the way, what time did I start, Laura? 11 o'clock. What time is it now? So I've only been preaching 3 minutes. All right. You guys can blame Tommy. He breaks the two horns. They represent Medo-Persia. The great horn is broken. That's Alexander the Great. And 4 notable horns take its place. Now, are you confused yet? All right. So on the banks, there is the goat. He has 2 big horns. That's the Persian Empire. The he-goat comes from the west. He's traveling east, and he's going so fast, and he runs right into that ram. Those 2 horns break. But in doing so, this notable horn on the he-goat, it also breaks. And when he dies, 4 horns come up. When Alexander the Great died, 4 of his generals took his place. Let me move on here to the next slide. The notable horn is Alexander the Great. Now, we said that his feet didn't even touch the ground. He was so quick. His father, Philip of Macedon, had brought the Greek Empire together. Macedon is just part of what we would consider Greece. And Philip, he goes on a campaign and he conquers all of the city-states, the little tribes of Greece, and he unites them. And when Daniel is 17 years old, Philip dies, and Daniel becomes the king of Macedon, and in turn inherits the empire of Greece. In the 90s, I remember I told you I used to read the National Geographic all the time. And I remember getting, in 1996, I believe it was, getting the National Geographic, and I was very excited because they'll tell you, the previous magazine, what the next one's going to be. They don't do that now, I don't think. I looked the other day and couldn't see it. You kind of have to guess. I think they want you to give them your money for your subscription, and, that makes it easier to get the money. But I'm not preaching about that. I mentioned this because I remember they found Philip's tomb. They had no idea where it was. By the way, to this day, one of the greatest archaeological secrets or mysteries, no one knows where Alexander the Great's tomb is. And so they're looking for it. But they found Philip, his father's tomb. And when they found Philip in that tomb, his skull had a gigantic injury, a crack where the calcium had given way, from his forehead all the way down to his cheek. An axe had made its way into his head and cut him from here all the way down to here, making him blind in his eye. But what was unique about that is, that did not kill him. Calcium had grown over it, and he lived. And one of his own men killed him in front of his son Alexander. Many people believe that Alexander had something to do with his death, along with his mother Olympus. But I don't actually think that's the case. There again, I'm not a historian. Alexander was a unique child, really an amazing sort of person. I think one of the greatest people that ever lived. His teacher was the famed Aristotle. You imagine having Aristotle as your personal tutor? And so Alexander was a brilliant man. His father was more of a barbarian, but his father wanted his son to be schooled in the finest school. And Aristotle would be followed for centuries, even millennia after his death. Alexander the Great was his student. Alexander the Great, when he was 17 years old, has to step up. He dies when he's 33 years old. In a span of 10 years after he becomes the king, in a span of 10 years, he has conquered the entire world. So much so that his last words on his dying bed, I was going to say a joke here, but this crowd's a rough one, Ben, so I'm going to just pass. But his last words were, "Are there no more worlds to conquer?" And then he dies. And there's a problem. Who is going to take his place? He has a son to his wife. His wife is a famous woman in the annals of history. Her name was Roxanna. Not to be confused with the song by the Police, Roxanne. But Roxanna does become a very popular name, shortened to Roxanne. She is not a Macedonian. She is his Babylonian wife. And so the first thing that happens is his son is killed and his wife Roxanne is killed. And the kingdom, it is in limbo for a little while until finally 4 generals take over. Now, these 4 generals, the 4 horns that come up in its place are Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander. Now, I want to show you the area here. Can you all see that? The one we're going to be primarily concerned with is from this area, the Seleucid, which the prominent city of this is Syria. Now, the little horn sprung up from one of 4 horns. Let me read this, 9 through 12. And out of one of them came forth a little horn. Now, we've already looked at a notable horn, which is Alexander the Great. Then there is the 4 horns, and out of these 4 horns comes one little horn. Are you confused yet? It waxed exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced, and it prospered. Now then, the little horn that sprung up from the Seleucids is a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Have you ever heard of him? Okay, he is the greatest monster of the Old Testament. The Jews said during the time of Christ, the Jews said there is no greater monster that ever lived than Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And we really know nothing about him in the Christian tradition. And the reason is probably because preachers do not preach these things on Sunday mornings, right? And so this might be the first time you're ever hearing of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. But you know about him Because Jesus in Matthew 24 says to the Christians, he gives them a warning about the destruction of Jerusalem that would come in 70 AD. And he says, when you see what? When you see the abomination of desolation, the time has come. Well, that doesn't mean much. Maybe that doesn't mean much to you. But there was a period that every Jew knew that was called, excuse me, that was called the abomination of desolation. And it is the period when Antiochus Epiphanes came into the temple and sacrificed a swine on the altar. And so Jesus says in his day, when you see the Romans come to desecrate the temple, you know the end is here. Now then, he had an eye on the pleasant land. This is Israel. I'm working on Revelation chapter 20 right now. And I'm going to preach a lesson on Revelation chapter 20. In all my years of being a member of the Lord's church, I've never heard anyone go through chapter 20 and give answers that are satisfactory. So if you want the answer to the mystery of Revelation chapter 20, and if you want to leave as a scholar, you'll have to come that Sunday night when I go through Revelation chapter 20. But you find the pleasant land in Revelation chapter 20, going back to Daniel. Folks, I would submit you have to get Daniel before you can understand Revelation. Now then, let's look at the next slide. Antiochus Epiphanes, great to the host of heaven. So here comes this little horn, and he is great to the host of heaven. That doesn't mean that he was great to God. What that meant is he ruled over the host of heaven. It's talking about the priesthood of Jerusalem. It was during this time that the high priesthood was literally sold to the highest bidder. And Antiochus Epiphanes, he put in his puppet high priests. You have Onias the first, and then when Antiochus Epiphanes leaves, Onias the second comes forward, and he is a decent priest, but when Antiochus Epiphanes gets back, that's when he utterly destroys the religion and stops the sacrifice. Notice he says he cast down the stars. The word stars here represents the actual priesthood. The Prince of Hosts, that's the high priest. And the scripture says the sacrifice was taken away and the sanctuary was cast down. The transgression of desolation, that is, the abomination of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot, the Bible says here. And so what he's going to do is he's going to defile the temple, and he's going to prevent sacrifices from being offered 3 years. Now, this begins at his reign, and 6 years there is a succession of an abomination of desolation. Let me go to the next one. Do any of you have an apocrypha? What is the apocrypha? The apocrypha are books. Some of you, if you have a King James, they used to sell the King James Bible, and there would be the apocrypha between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And one of the prominent books in the apocrypha is the book of Maccabees. Now, in 1 Maccabees, in chapter 1 and verse 44, the King James, the English Standard Version of this reads, "For the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and the festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and the holy people." Now Josephus says, "Now it so fell out that these things were done on the very same day on which their divine worship had fallen off, and was reduced to profane and common use after 3 years' time. For so it was that the temple was made desolate by Antiochus, and so continued for 3 years. For this desolation happened in the temple in the 140th and 5th year, on the 7th on the 20th day of the month of Apelles, and on the 150th and 3rd Olympiad. So Josephus literally gives us the history that Daniel prophesied. All of this would take place in 3 years. And it all came to happen. Now, the last part of the chapter, verses 15 through 25, gives the interpretation. Do you know who is giving the interpretation? An angel. And what angel is that? The angel Gabriel. I just went ahead and used myself as a model for this one, Laura. The angel Gabriel explains the nation and its kings. He lets them know, or lets Daniel know, that Greeks will conquer the Medo-Persians, and that the little horn, who is Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he will magnify himself. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes called himself something else. He called himself Theos Epiphanes, which means the manifest God. The Jews gave him a nickname that translated to the madman. But he is a man who wants to make himself God. Now then, the end of the vision. In 26 through 27, we find that Daniel has envisioned hundreds of years of prophecies. We're going to look at that very soon, tonight, in Daniel's 70 weeks. It comes out to 490 years, which brings you up to the time of Christ. And Daniel ends the prophecy by saying, this is a long time down the road. It's not going to come to pass shortly. All right? And so 490 years was a very long prophecy. And he is told to seal up. By the way, when we get to the book of Revelation, we are told that these are things which will shortly come to pass. Shortly is a period shorter than 490 years, isn't it? And so then these things would shortly come to pass, and we are told in the book of Revelation not to seal the revelation up. But this is how our chapter ends. And this is how our sermon ends. We live in a world right now that is full of madmen. This thing in Russia scares me. You know, for the longest time, we knew that Putin was a proud man. We knew that he was ex-KGB. We knew that he was a dangerous man. We knew that he was an oligarch. But we've only begun to realize that he's a madman. And it's scary, isn't it? It is certainly more scary for the Ukrainians, who are under the oppression of such a madman. But this is not the first madman that I've seen in my life. Tell me, what year, circa, what year were you born? 38. You were born into a world sent into confusion by a madman. Hitler. He was the notable horn, the larger of the two, but he had another horn that helped him, a smaller one, a man named Mussolini. As time went on, Pol Pot, Stalin, you could go through the list. In 1989, Laura, we went into Iraq. We had quite a character. Our hero was a man named Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf. Remember him? And you had to deal with Saddam Hussein. And then you dealt with a man named Milosevic. Do you remember him? Do you remember Bosnia-Herzegovina? And then it wouldn't be long until we were introduced to a man seemingly in one day named Osama bin Laden. All of your life, Tommy, There have been madmen. And I don't think it'll stop. But what this chapter does, it gives hope. In the midst of all of this, we see Jesus. The stone which breaks all of the other kingdoms and humbles them, that comes from the mountain, not made by hands. And one of the greatest lessons in the book of Daniel is for the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, who is brought down so low that he becomes a madman. His fingernails grow out long, his hair grows out long. Matter of fact, many psychologists believe and doctors believe that he had what is called boanthropy. He was like a cow out in the field eating. He was brought low. By the way, that's not unusual. Have you ever heard of a man named Howard Hughes? One time the richest man in all the world. Yes. That's not his pet name for me, Spruce Goose. He's talking about a plane that Howard Hughes actually built. But he lived finally on an island in a white house. When I say white house, I mean everything was white. He had everything painted white because he was so scared of dust. And there was a picture in Time magazine, which I used to have, I don't have it anymore, where he's sitting in a diaper and he has Kleenex boxes that he's wearing on his feet for shoes, and his nails are like an eagle's nails. His hair is so long, and he's literally become an animal. He was diagnosed with boanthropy. Went crazy. But the Bible says King Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses. And when he came to his senses, he made a statement that the God of heaven, Jehovah, rules in the kingdoms of men. And take heart, folks. The God of heaven still rules today in the kingdoms of men. I want to encourage you to continue reading the book of Daniel and all other prophecy. It'll bolster your faith. If you have a need this